Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well. We're just admitting people from the waiting room now, so if you can just bear with us for a moment, we'll get started. We've a lot to go through, so please come with an open mind. Just to help the process, there's two things you can do. If you hover over your own thumbnail, you can switch to small active video that will reduce the size of it. And also at the top of the screen, if you go to options, you can do side-by-side option, will allow you to look at both the presentation and the people who have joined in. Carly is co-hosting this, so she's going to be monitoring the chat room. I won't be responding to the chats. At the end of it, we'll come to that. There probably won't be time for questions today, but we will respond to those questions after when we upload the presentation. So the emphasis on this, the title is The Business Case for Compassion in Leadership. Some of you may be a little bit, I know, skeptical or cynical. That's good about the title, thinking, oh, this is something that's touchy-feely, the soft side of leadership. It is not. It's actually the hard side. It takes some courage to lead with compassion. But we are focusing on the business case for this to show that it is worthwhile for you to consider that. So hopefully by the end of this, we will have convinced you to think about your own leadership style and look at your own organization. The other thing you might do is, it will be inevitable as we go through this, you'll be thinking about some of the current world leaders, no names mentioned, and you might see what they are doing wrong at the moment. Actually, it's very interesting. I just read an article this morning where one of the most effective world leaders at the moment is seen to be the lady from New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, who they say practices a very effective empathetic style. So that kind of fits in with what we are saying here. The agenda today, we're going to look at the business case from that perspective. As we go through this, we're going to look at leadership, and leadership is behavioral. You know, you might say, what is your leadership style? The answer to that, the correct answer is, it depends, because leadership is contextual, it's situational. So you should have more than one leadership style depending on the circumstances. So we're going to look at elements of that. We're using as the basis of this, and we've built on research that was done originally in 2008 at the crash, when they looked at effective leadership in those times, and they've updated it. At that time, they dwelt more on the empathetic style. We're going to build on that and look at compassion and compare them. So why are we here? Employee distress is a real issue. Contemporary workplaces, we know it's very demanding, and the separation between work and life is becoming even smaller, and that increases the likelihood of individual distress. Now note that I'm not saying stress. Most people misinterpret that. They say they're under stress, when actually they are not. It's distress, technically. Stress can actually be quite positive, because it can get the adrenaline flowing and it can be challenging. Distress is when the demands are greater than the resources available. And that's what distresses people, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. Sources of distress in the work, it could be downsizing, it could be co-worker dynamics, it could be mergers, it could be life-related. There might be some unfortunate bereavement in the family. Your children, especially teenagers, can be quite demanding. Could be financial issues. However, the other thing is, it can be additive, in as much as one big source can result in high levels of distress. That's where we are with the pandemic, COVID-19, one big source. However, many small sources can add up to high levels of distress where they accumulate. So the path to compassion that we're looking at, and the research I've built on from this, is based on a tool and work that was done by the Management Research Group, who's one of our strategic partners. So I'm going to use some of their data in this to show you the business case. So the path to compassion is, first of all, noticing that someone is suffering. I can see that you're in distress. Feeling empathetic concern means I feel bad that you're suffering. And then finally, the empathy in action, responding with compassion, I'm going to do something to relieve it. Now that's an important step forward, because the difficulty with empathy, as we look at that, is that you can take on the burden yourself. It's called transference. When you're talking to people who have issues, some of their issues land on your shoulders. So by the end of the day, if you've spoken to a number of people, you're quite drained because you're taking on the empathy. Compassion allows you to professionally stand back and move from that and not become another casualty of the situation. So why would we look at this? What is the positive impact? Let's look at the bottom line there. You've got greater employee commitment, you've pride in the organization, increased drive towards professional development, reduction in punitive actions towards others, openness to receiving help, etc. So some really good pointers as to why the witnessing of compassion can be excellent. So on the path to compassion, first of all, we need to develop empathy. And what are the advantages of demonstrating that, and what behaviors are associated with that? But the ultimate goal is to move to compassion. And what are the changes? What advantages do compassion have over empathy? If you look at some of the things about the overall organizational resilience there, the receiver of compassion has a physical and psychological healing. There's reduced anxiety and stress, a sense of being valued, a tendency to share a positive light on events. There's reduction of compassion fatigue. You can really drain your energy. And the giver of the compassion actually gains a more of a pro-social identity, and they're seen as a strong leader. So it's not a weak leader to show compassion, it's actually strong. And you get very meaningful connections with people, not disassociated meanings. So the definition of empathy, measured behaviorally. So they are perceived by others, and this, again, coming back to the tool that was used, this was a 360-degree tool, and I'll share some of the details with that. It shows a genuine interest in other people. In other words, empathy is active listening. It's putting yourself in the other person's shoes to understand where they're coming from, and kind of closing down your own preconceived ideas. It's a genuine concern about the welfare of others. It's about being sensitive and kind. Now, kind is a word that's coming to the forefront because although there are horrific things going on around us, people are actually being a little bit more kind to each other. You know, when they're passing in the street, even though they got the mask and keeping the social distance, they're actually smiling and nodding, whereas previously they would walk past them. Sympathetic to a degree. You have to be careful with sympathy because sometimes that is taking on too much of the burden and distracting you from what needs to be done by being overly sympathetic to an individual. Now, just to give you a couple of details, if I check here quickly, within this exercise, the research between the original one and the updated version from 2008 to today, 39,431 leaders, a very significant sample. Those leaders were in 25 different industries, in 45 different countries, and although it's not relevant in this case, 51% were male, 29% were female, which I think is, without getting into any gender debates. If you do the addition there, that means 20% decided not to share whether they were male or female, okay, which is interesting. But there's no gender divide here. Within the statistics, there was no gender difference. So if some of you attempted to say, oh, that's a feminine trait or that's a male trait, it's not. There was very, very little difference. The behaviors in leadership, you'll see on a graph later, there are 22 different leadership behaviors that were looked at. And when it comes to competencies in leadership, there were 31. And that's pretty significant, as you'll see in the last slide. So here are the behaviors that characterize empathetic leaders, and they are medians. And you can see just above the graphs there, the high empathy leaders, there were 12,000, others 27,000 in this study. Now, if you look at the graph, the lighter blue is the high empathy leaders, and you can see some significant differences, like under creating a vision, the self score was lower. That means that they were more team-minded rather than relying on themselves as the sole decision maker. They were more open to other people. In the developing followership, you'll see that it peaked around the outgoing, which is being more social to people rather than sitting in their ivory tower. They were out talking to people and listening to them. Following through, the control and feedback, the achieving results are all less emphasized on this. So they're saying it's not just about the numbers, it's about the people in this case. And in the final set, which is team playing, you can see over on the right-hand side, you'll see that every one of the behaviors is higher in the empathy leadership. That's about cooperation and collaboration. It's about consensual listening to people's opinions and ideas. It is about showing deference, being a strong leader, and certainly the empathy score itself is the highest of all of the behavioral scores. Now, on this, high isn't necessarily good and low isn't necessarily bad, because there are variations on that, which is another day's discussion, but it shows the high empathy. So to coach leaders to become more empathetic, you've got to foster collaboration and welcome input from others during the decision-making process. So it is about cooperation and collaboration, sharing ideas. It is to be more outgoing, more social. It doesn't mean you're just shooting the breeze with people. It means you're talking to them about their jobs and what's going on around them. And consensual is a particularly strong one, because you're not saying, I've got all the answers. You're saying, I want to hear some of your ideas. Then the strong leader knows when there's been enough discussion and can make a decision as to what to move forward on. Some of the things you should de-emphasize to a degree is putting on high degrees of control and feedback, trying to be, the sole leader, if you like, without any intervention with others. Try not to be too dominant and competitive. Focus on the production, but not to a high degree. You don't lose sight of it. And certainly with the self one, not just relying on yourself for the decision-making process. So let's move on to compassion. What we're saying is compassion itself is stronger, because empathy might not be the strongest way, the strongest advantage when looking at the business case, the broader and cognitive skills. So compassion we've defined as empathy in action, putting something behind it. So in an organizational setting, compassion, it's the ability to develop people. It's an opportunity to give them the chance, delegate to them, find out what they're capable of doing, stretch them a little bit in a positive way, work with diverse people. You'll be working remotely with different nations, different ethics. As I say, there's no gender division here, and demonstrating a good ethical leadership. Okay. So let's have a look at the behaviors, coming back to that. And what they've done here is divided those leaders that showed the high compassion skill set, over 2,000, versus other ones who were still high empathy, but not showing the compassion, to see where the difference lie. And there are a few changes. If we go through each one of the 6 sets, so the 6 sets within leadership, it's saying there's something about creating a vision. There's something about selling that vision, developing followership. There's something about implementing the vision, following through, achieving results, and team playing. And then down at the bottom, you can see all 22 behaviors that fit in the different sets. So coming back to the graph, we're interested in the green line, the compassionate leaders. You'll find that they're higher in this section here, if you can see my cursor moving, on the innovative and technical. That means they're considering new ideas, they're open to change. And the technical means they're still abreast of the key business context of the business they're in. They know their business and are demonstrating that. And the last behavior on there is sorry, I don't know why it did that. Sorry, a little blip there, it jumped of its own accord. The strategic one, they plan ahead, even though we're in unprecedented times, which means there is no case history. Nevertheless, they are considering the future and planning ahead. So they are more strategic. In developing followership, you'll see that they are pretty much on a level with the others, not very differentiated. And also in implementing the vision. Where it begins to change a little bit is in achieving results. Now, it's still tracking, but the one that's higher for the compassionate leader is the management focus has gone up a little bit from the empathy. In other words, they are focused and they are leading stronger than the empathetic leader. In the team playing, again, it's tracking pretty closely. The only one that's a little bit different there is the authority one. Now, that's kind of interesting. Authority in this instrument is looking at, are you loyal to the organizational structure? So if I was being a little bit facetious, I might say if you're working in the public sector, authority is very high because there is a very deep hierarchy of about 15 layers and everybody has to go up and down the silos. Down at the lower end of authority, that is probably a very entrepreneurial startup where there are no ground rules and everything is a big team rather than any lines of authority. What it's saying there with the type of score that it's showing is that would be a leader who's more interested in cross-functional teams and crossing boundaries, not working in silos, getting the right expertise together in a small team to have an impact. That would be the compassionate leader. So those are the small differences in change that make all the difference there. So how do you coach empathetic leaders to become compassionate leaders. They've got to be more open to change. They should be innovative. They've got to be influential. They've got to think through the implications of their actions. That's part of the strategy. They should communicate clearly. Excuse me. And with that, I always use the word clarity instead of communication, because you've got to be very sure that people are clear about what's expected of them and what their role is. And you've got to keep your specialized knowledge up to date. So what are the potential roadblocks for focusing on self-awareness? So there's a few little warning flags here. And again, you might think about some of our current world leaders when we come through this. Less empathetic and less compassionate leaders score lower on self-awareness more than their competent counterparts. And you can go way back to the 5th century BC to the Chinese culture there. Some of their philosophers there would come out with things like, you cannot know other people until you know yourself. And the man, sorry, they said man, they had no gender, so apologies for that, I'm quoting. A man would be learned when he knows others, but if he knows himself, he's wise. So self-awareness is critical for development. So any leader who's a little bit less self-aware actually might need a bit of extra help from his counterparts. And the last bullet is an interesting one as well, that they found out that less compassionate leaders underestimate the emphasis on clarity of communications. They are not clear. They believe that everybody understands them, that they've got some divine right to be, what they say is understood. They don't double check that people get what they're on about. So potential blind spots. Less compassionate leaders tend to overestimate how much they emphasize some associated behaviors. They might overestimate how they take charge. They might overestimate how knowledgeable they are in their expertise and how comfortable they are taking risks. So again, you need to be wary of people who are overestimating their own ability. They're working at a higher level than they actually are. And to be more compassionate, leaders should not be too informal. So when the empathy, you're being very open and gregarious. Compassion, you tone it down a little bit. So you keep the conversations quite focused on the business and relevant, not to go off a tangent. So it's a very focused, outgoing, but you still are doing a lot of management by walking about. So the positive impact of compassion. Empathy is related to effectiveness. So again, I stress, this is about effective leadership, not soft skills. So looking at the benefits there, leaders who demonstrate empathy outperform other leaders in 17 out of the 31 leadership competencies, which is significant. That's more than 50% they outperform. However, compassion is related to even greater effectiveness. Compassionate leaders outperform other empathetic leaders on 30 out of the 31 measures. On the 31st, it was actually equal, it wasn't less. So you could say they just totally outperform empathetic managers. So that is the strong business case for compassion to be an effective leader. So the path to compassion, let's quickly look at that and summarize it so you have a few takeaways. To be more empathetic, emphasize collaboration and working in a friendly, informal manner without placing too much emphasis on process and results. Now, some people I know will struggle with that because they will say it's all about the numbers. But again, it is not just about the numbers. To appear more compassionate, you take charge and you rely on your expertise when it matters. You consider the broader consequences, be open to change and breaking conventions in some cases, and be clear without being overly informal. So those are things to consider. If you need any further information, please contact Carly. As I say, there's really not time in the half hour to go into any questions. I'm sure many of you do have some questions, and Carly's been monitoring the chat box there to see if there's any comments. So we might draw her in shortly if she wants to unmute her mic, but please contact that. What I want you to do now is to think about this and say, what are you going to do different as an individual when you get back to your desk, wherever that desk might be these days? Was there something in there that's been a takeaway, an eye-opener that you are going to use moving forward? So thank you for joining in this. I hope you got something out of it. You found it worthwhile. Carly, do you want to come in and make any comments about the chats to finalize this?
Hi, everyone. Yes, if you have any questions right now, we do have a few minutes. You could quickly type in a question. If not, feel free to email me. I'll put my email again in the chat, and we'd be happy to come back at you with thorough answers for your questions and any feedback you might have as well. So thanks, everyone, for joining. All right, I'm just seeing messages come through. Sounds like people will probably email me with some additional questions, and everyone's just expressing gratitude and glad you enjoyed the presentation. So I hope that everyone has a very nice day and a great rest of your week as well. Take care.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for engaging.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right.